Lesson 3, Section 1. In this first grammar presentation, we'll be talking about inflection, and then verbs. We'll look at person and number. We'll look at conjugation in English. We'll look at singular endings of Greek verbs in the present indicative active, and we will talk about word order in Greek. Inflection is the process by which words' forms change as their functions do. In English as well as in Greek, for instance, when a word changes function in a sentence, its form often changes as well. Not always, but frequently. English is considered an analytic language. Analysis, of course, it means the breaking down of things into their parts. And English as an analytic language is minimally inflected. And for that reason, the word order is very important. An example of this analytic nature in practice is I have found. We use 3 different words to express what in some other languages, Greek included, is a single word, basically a single concept. So Greek is synthetic. Synthesis, of course, is the opposite process. It's the process of putting things back together again. Greek is a highly inflected language, and for that reason, word order is more flexible. The Greek equivalent of the English phrase, I have found, a 3-word phrase, is the 1-word phrase, heureka. We get our English expression eureka from this, of course. So here we see the difference between a synthetic language like Greek and an analytic language like English. The inflection of nouns, etc., is called declension. We'll talk about the etc. later. And the inflection of verbs is called conjugation. And we will be focusing in this grammar presentation on conjugation. In English and Greek, verbs are conjugated according to a couple different things. The first is person. There are 3 persons in both English and Greek. The first is first person. This is when the speaker is the subject of the verb. I tell the doctor. The speaker here, the I, the person speaking, is the subject of the verb tell, the person doing the action being described. In the second person, it is the addressee who is performing the action being described, who is the subject of the verb. You tell me. And then in the third person, a third party, neither I nor you, is the subject. The doctor tells me, a he, she, or an it. We also have number that verbs are conjugated according to in both English and Greek. So in English we have 2 numbers, singular, the doctor tells me, and plural, the doctors tell me. And here we see an example of how this verb here, tell, is being inflected. In the singular we have the tells, and the plural we have the tell, an example of inflection in action. In English and Greek, verbs are also conjugated according to some other things. Tense, mood, voice. We're not going to talk about these very much for a while, but it's important to have the terms out on the table. Now, let's look at conjugation in English. Let's look at the verb tell in the present indicative active. Tell, of course, is the dictionary form of this verb. It's the form we would look this word up in the dictionary. And then the present indicative active is basically the tense, mood, and voice we happen to be looking at this verb in. There are other tenses, moods, and voices, and the conjugations would look different depending on which those we're looking at, which combination of those. So we have singular and plural, of course, as we discussed, number, and then we have person, first, second, third, in both of those numbers. And in English, the conjugation is very simple. It's tell, with one little exception there in the third person singular. What this means, of course, is that there's a great deal of ambiguity. The verb here on its own doesn't tell us much about the number or the person of the subject. And to express that, we actually need another word. This is another example of English's analytic nature in action. So we have to use a personal pronoun or an explicit subject in almost every case. we have to say I tell, you tell. Otherwise, the tell isn't going to express to our listener who it is that's actually doing the telling. This is an important difference between English and Greek, as we will see. We need to use that pronoun. Let's look at a Greek conjugation. So, pao, I stop, in the present indicative active. This is the form that we're going to see verbs introduced in the readings. We're going to see the lexical form, not the dictionary form, because in Greek we don't use dictionaries, we use lexicons or lexica. And the lexical form happens to be the first person singular form of the verb, the I stop. This is a basic translation of that word there, pao. And tense, mood, and voice, again, we're going to see this verb have different forms in other tenses, moods, and voices, and combinations of those. But let's look at the singular forms, first, second, third persons, of the verb pao, I stop, in the present indicative active. Now, in English, to conjugate the verb tell, we start with the stem of the verb. The stem in English is basically just the dictionary form. It's tell, and we happen to add an S onto it in the third person singular, but we see that stem in all forms of the verb. In Greek, it's not quite as simple as that. To get the stem, that is the part of the verb that we see in all numbers and persons, we need to drop the omega. That leaves us with pao. This is the verb stem, and we're going to plug that stem into all of these slots. We get pao, pao, pao. We're going to see that element, that stem, in all of the different forms of this verb here. And next we need to add our endings. A verb in Greek consists at least of the stem and the ending. And for the first person singular, this is easy. It's just the lexical form. It's the pao, all, the omega. So we add here our ending onto the stem. And a translation of this would be I stop, am stopping, or do stop, I do stop. Now again, the important thing to notice is that we don't actually need to include a pronoun. We don't have to include the Greek equivalent of I. We wouldn't say I pao. Pao, that omega there, that ending actually conveys that information. It tells us we're dealing with the first person singular. And that's because in the other persons and numbers we have different endings. Pao ace tells us we're dealing with a you. You stop, you are stopping, you do stop. Third person singular, it's the same. Pao a, different ending than the other two endings. He, she, or it stops. He, she, or it is stopping. He, she, or it does stop. All we need to express that long phrase, in English it's 3 words, she is stopping, we can just say pao e, 1 word in Greek. The last thing we need to do to conjugate this verb is to accentuate it properly, in this case by the rules of recessive accentuation. We get an acute on the penult. If you have any questions about how accentuation works in Greek, you can look at some of the handouts. And these are the singular endings, as well as the stem, the forms of pao, I stop, in the present indicative active. We'll look at plural forms in the next lesson. Now, a word on word order in Greek. Since Greek is a highly inflected, synthetic language, word order is more flexible than in English. We're going to look at an example sentence. First, we have to learn some new vocabulary. Huo, I rain, I send rain, and hosdeus, Zeus. Let's look at a very basic sentence. Hosdeus hue. This means, of course, Zeus sends rain, or Zeus is sending rain, or Zeus does send rain, depending on how we translate that verb. That verb, of course, we see the third person singular ending, a, epsilon iota, which tells us that it's a he, she, or it performing the action, and we happen to get the actor very explicitly here, hosdeus hue. Now this is functionally equivalent to this, hue hosdeus. We've switched the order of the words, but it means something equivalent. There are different connotations that different word orders have. We'll talk about those later on. For right now, we can think of these two phrases, these two sentences, as functionally equivalent. Zeus sends rain, has Deus hue, or hue has Deus. Now, for the forms of the words we looked at, for the accidents, which has to do with forms and inflections, sometimes accidents is called morphology, you can look at page 62 for our verbs like pao, verbs in omega. And if you want to read more about verbs in Greek, you can take a look at pages 60 and 61 in the grammar. Thank you very much.